The base fell silent when the A-10 Thunderbolt II appeared on approach, trailing smoke like a dying comet. Tower operators leaned forward, hands frozen over consoles, watching the aircraft drag itself through Nevada sky with one engine completely dead and the other coughing black clouds that spread like ink in water. The landing gear hung asymmetrical, one wheel locked, the other dangling at an angle that made veterans wince. Hydraulic fluid streamed from the belly in ribbons that caught afternoon light, and the entire right stabilizer had been sheared away, leaving exposed metal that glinted raw and savage. Nobody spoke. The radio crackled with the pilot's voice, calm as Sunday morning, requesting priority landing while the aircraft shuddered through air currents it could barely navigate. Ground crews scrambled, foam trucks racing toward the runway, but everyone knew what they were watching. This wasn't a routine emergency. This was a death dance, and the pilot was leading with grace that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The A-10 dropped altitude in stuttering increments, nose high, compensating for the missing stabilizer with aileron adjustments so precise they looked choreographed. Someone in the tower whispered that it shouldn't be flying at all, that physics had already written the ending. But the aircraft kept coming, defying equations and expectations, guided by hands that understood machinery the way poets understand words. When it finally touched down, sparks erupted from the damaged gear, metal screaming against concrete in a sound that made grown men cover their ears. The aircraft slewed sideways, tires smoking, and for 3 eternal seconds it seemed certain to cartwheel into oblivion. Then it straightened impossibly and rolled to a stop just past the midfield marker, surrounded by foam trucks and emergency vehicles that converged like worried relatives. The canopy opened, and Captain Vera Ghost Dalka climbed out with deliberate movements, removing her helmet to reveal dark hair plastered with sweat and eyes that hadn't quite processed survival yet. She stood on the wing, looking at the wreckage she'd piloted home, and base personnel stopped pretending they weren't starring. 3 years ago, Vera had been grounded after an incident that fractured her spine and destroyed her reputation in equal measure. Command had declared her flight status permanently revoked, her career reduced to desk assignments and administrative purgatory. The medical board had been unanimous. The psychological evaluation had been damning. Her squadron had moved on without her, and the hangar gossip had turned her into a cautionary tale about pilots who pushed too hard and broke too completely. But someone had made a mistake today, or perhaps a calculated gamble. When Lieutenant Morrison's aircraft suffered catastrophic failure over the range, when his ejection seat malfunctioned and left him unconscious in a plummeting cockpit, when every second meant the difference between recovery and crater, someone had remembered that Vera Dalka still held a valid flight physical, technically speaking. Someone had remembered that before the incident, before the board, before the whispers, she had been the pilot other pilots studied. And someone had handed her the keys to the chase aircraft, a backup A-10 that was supposed to fly observation only, never combat, never crisis. That had been 6 hours ago. The debriefing room smelled like burnt coffee and anxiety, fluorescent lights casting everyone in shades of exhaustion. Vera sat at the table's end, flight suit still dark with sweat, while Colonel Marcus Webb reviewed footage that shouldn't exist. The gun camera had captured everything, angles and altitudes that transformed crisis into mathematics. Morrison's aircraft spinning through 12,000 feet, control surfaces locked, the cockpit canopy reflecting sun in desperate flashes. Vera's voice on the recording stayed level, calling positions while she maneuvered within meters of the tumbling jet, close enough that turbulence rattled her instruments and G-forces compressed her vision into tunnels of gray. She'd matched Morrison's spin rate, an aerobatic impossibility that required processing aircraft behavior faster than conscious thought allowed. The room watched her perform calculations that quantum computers would envy, sliding her A-10 into formation with chaos itself. She'd fired her cannon, not at Morrison but past him, using the GAU-8's recoil and muzzle blast to create atmospheric disturbance that altered his spin axis by critical degrees. 3 bursts, each precisely timed, each pushing Morrison's aircraft fractionally toward stability while risking collision that would have killed them both instantly. The physics were insane, the execution was supernatural, and the result was that Morrison's aircraft had stabilized enough for his backup systems to engage, for his consciousness to return, for his ejection seat to finally fire at an altitude that permitted parachute deployment. He'd landed hard but breathing, greeting rescue crews with confusion about why he was alive. Vera had circled overhead until confirmation of his recovery, then discovered that her heroics had cost her everything mechanical. The atmospheric disturbance had sucked debris into her intake, shredding turbine blades and fracturing fuel lines. Her hydraulics had failed from stress fractures that propagated through systems never designed for such abuse. She'd had 70 miles between crisis and base, with one engine dying and flight controls degrading with each passing second. She'd nursed the aircraft home through sheer understanding of how metal bends before it breaks, how air moves over damaged surfaces, how machines respond when treated like partners rather than equipment. Webb closed the footage and removed his reading glasses, studying Vera with the expression of someone recalculating fundamental assumptions. Major Tessa Park sat beside him, director of flight operations, her jaw tight with emotions she hadn't authorized. Across the table, Lieutenant Morrison occupied a wheelchair, neck brace immobilizing his head, eyes fixed on Vera with the intensity of someone who'd glimpsed their own mortality and found it wearing someone else's face. 3 years ago, these same people had signed documents ending Vera's career. The incident had been straightforward, at least officially. Training exercise over the Pacific, mechanical failure in her wingman's aircraft, Vera attempting a recovery maneuver that violated protocol and physics in equal measure. She'd succeeded, bringing her wingman home alive, but the stress had compressed her spine beyond acceptable parameters. The medical board had grounded her, citing permanent physical limitations that made high-G flight dangerous. But there had been other documents, quieter ones, suggesting that Vera's decision-making showed concerning patterns, that her willingness to violate protocol indicated psychological issues requiring evaluation. The psychological evaluation had been conducted by Captain David Chen, a flight surgeon who specialized in determining which pilots were stable and which were liabilities waiting to manifest. He'd interviewed Vera for 6 hours, running through scenarios and ink blots and questions designed to map the architecture of her decision-making. His report had been thorough and devastating, concluding that Vera exhibited hero-complex tendencies that prioritized dramatic rescues over calculated risk assessment. She'd read it once, in the administrative office where her flight status was officially revoked, and hadn't argued. Her spine had hurt too much for fighting, and the painkillers had made arguing seem pointless anyway. She'd taken the desk assignment, the administrative purgatory where good pilots went to file reports and remember what flying felt like. Her call sign had survived the transition, though its meaning had shifted. Ghost had originally referenced her ability to appear in enemy airspace without warning, to strike from angles that shouldn't exist and vanish before retaliation could form. After the grounding, it had taken on darker connotations, describing a pilot haunted by what she could no longer do, a specter wandering hangar she could no longer claim. Webb leaned forward, elbows on the table, and the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. His career had been built on making impossible decisions look routine, on transforming chaos into doctrine, and right now he was watching his carefully constructed reality develop cracks. The regulations were clear about grounded pilots. The medical documentation was unambiguous about permanent limitations, but the footage was clearer still, showing capability that transcended documentation, and Morrison's presence was the most unambiguous argument possible. Vera met Webb's gaze without flinching, though her hand stayed flat on the table, fingers splayed to stop trembling. She'd learned to hide pain years ago, back when admitting it meant losing everything. The spinal injury had healed imperfectly, leaving nerve pathways that occasionally misfired and vertebrae that ground together during high-G maneuvers. Flying Morrison's rescue had probably undone months of physical therapy, compressed discs that physicians had carefully coaxed back into alignment, and she could feel the damage accumulating like debt she'd eventually have to pay. But Morrison was alive, breathing somewhere beneath that neck brace, and the mathematics of that exchange seemed favorable regardless of personal cost. Webb finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that would ripple through careers and protocols. He asked the question everyone had been avoiding, the one that transformed heroism into accountability. Why had she violated direct orders? The chase aircraft had been designated for observation only, explicitly restricted from tactical maneuvering, and Vera had ignored those restrictions the moment Morrison's crisis had escalated beyond textbook recovery. She transformed a monitoring mission into aerobatic intervention, spending authority she didn't possess to attempt rescue that regulations prohibited. Her answer came without hesitation, without the careful phrasing that smart officers use to navigate career-ending moments. She'd done it because Morrison would have done it for her, because letting him die while she watched would have been its own kind of death, because some decisions transcend protocol and answer to older authorities than military regulation. The silence that followed her answer stretched until it became uncomfortable, then passed through discomfort into something else entirely. Major Park shifted in her seat, and the movement carried implications that had nothing to do with ergonomics. She'd been the one who'd approved Vera's flight physical renewal 6 months ago, a routine administrative action that had seemed meaningless at the time. Vera had submitted the paperwork more from habit than hope, and Park had signed it without considering that bureaucratic technicalities could transform into operational realities. The medical board's grounding had been based on permanent limitations, but it had never explicitly revoked her physical qualification, leaving a gap in documentation that had existed unnoticed until today. Park had spent the last 3 hours reviewing those documents, searching for the error that had placed a grounded pilot in an active aircraft, and finding only her own signature authorizing possibilities she'd never imagined. Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice rough from the neck brace's pressure on his throat. He described regaining consciousness at 4,000 feet, ejection seat armed, parachute deployment seconds away, and looking up through the canopy to see Vera's A-10 packing him, impossibly close, wing tip almost touching his. He'd seen her face through the canopy, focused and calm, eyes tracking his aircraft's movement with the precision of someone solving equations in real time. He'd felt the atmospheric disturbance from her cannon fire, the way it had altered his spin enough to let backup systems engage, enough to give him fighting chance instead of certain death. He'd understood in that moment that she was destroying her own aircraft to save him, spending mechanical reliability the way soldiers spend ammunition, and he'd wanted to tell her to stop, to save herself. But his radio had been dead, and his voice had been trapped behind shock and G-forces. Webb listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing, though his fingers drummed against the table in patterns that suggested accelerated processing. Command decisions were supposed to follow clear hierarchies, predetermined flowcharts that transformed complex situations into manageable procedures. But sometimes reality produced scenarios that flowcharts couldn't address, moments when by-the-book responses guaranteed the wrong outcome, and this was clearly one of those moments. The regulations said Vera shouldn't have been flying. The medical board said her spine couldn't handle the stress. The psychological evaluation said her judgment was compromised by hero-complex tendencies. But Morrison was alive, sitting in that wheelchair because Vera had ignored all those documents and trusted older wisdom about what pilots owed each other. Webb stood, and the movement commanded attention without requiring announcement. He walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where Vera's battered A-10 sat surrounded by maintenance crews who were documenting damage with cameras and measuring tape and expressions of disbelief. The aircraft looked like it had fought a war and barely survived, metal skin torn and scorched, systems reduced to barely functional approximations. But it had brought its pilot home, and in aviation that was the only mathematics that ultimately mattered. He turned back to the room and delivered his decision with the finality of someone who'd stopped consulting regulations and started trusting instinct. Vieira was going back on flight status, effective immediately, pending updated medical evaluation that would focus on capability rather than limitation. The words hung in the air like contrails, visible and impossible to retract. Major Park's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to catalog, settling finally on something resembling relief mixed with apprehension. Morrison's face split into a grin that the neck brace couldn't quite suppress, and Vieira remained perfectly still, processing information that rewrote her understanding of possible futures. Webb continued, establishing parameters that would protect everyone's careers while acknowledging what the footage had proven. Vieira would undergo comprehensive medical reevaluation, not by the board that had grounded her, but by specialists who understood that human capability couldn't always be reduced to standardized metrics. She'd fly evaluation sorties that would document her actual performance under controlled conditions, building evidence that would either support her return to full flight status or confirm that today had been anomaly rather than demonstration of sustained capability. And she'd submit to psychological reevaluation, this time by someone other than Captain Chen, someone who understood that heroism and recklessness occupied different categories despite surface similarities. The conditions were reasonable, almost generous, given how thoroughly she'd violated protocol. But they also carried implications that made Vera's chest tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. Webb was giving her a chance, but chances came with expectations and scrutiny that could be harder to navigate than simple prohibition. She'd have to prove herself not once but continuously, demonstrating that today hadn't been luck or desperation but genuine capability that could be relied upon. She'd have to fly under observation, performing for evaluators who would document every decision and reaction, transforming intimate communion between pilot and machine into data points for administrative review. And she'd have to convince new psychologists that her willingness to violate protocol wasn't pathology but wisdom, that some rules existed to be broken when circumstances demanded, that the calculations she performed in crisis moments came from clarity rather than compulsion. Morrison's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, rough but insistent. He wanted to say something for the record, something that would be documented in the official debriefing transcript and couldn't be quietly edited later. Webb nodded permission, and Morrison leaned forward despite the neck brace's restriction, fixing his gaze on Vieira with intensity that bordered on uncomfortable. He stated clearly and formally that Captain Vera Dalka had saved his life through skill that exceeded anything he'd witnessed in 15 years of military aviation. He stated that her decision to violate protocol had been the only correct decision available, that observation-only restrictions made sense for routine situations, but became suicide mandates when circumstances escalated beyond textbook parameters. And he stated that anyone who suggested Vera's judgment was compromised by hero-complex tendencies was fundamentally misunderstanding what heroism actually required. The words were unambiguous and would be impossible to ignore in any future evaluation. Morrison was spending his own credibility to defend hers, making his survival testimony that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Park added her own statement, nodding for the record that she'd personally reviewed Vieira's flight physical documentation and found it technically valid despite the medical board's grounding. The board had made recommendations, but recommendations weren't regulations, and flight status was ultimately determined by current capability rather than historical limitations. Her voice carried the careful precision of someone building legal protection, establishing that today's events had exploited gap in documentation rather than constituting outright violation. Webb closed the debriefing with instructions that were really warnings, though delivered with the neutral tone of operational guidance. Vera would maintain discretion about today's events until official evaluation was complete. She wouldn't discuss the rescue with media or unauthorized personnel, wouldn't allow herself to become symbol or controversy before command had time to shape narrative appropriately. She'd report for medical evaluation at 0600 tomorrow, prepared for comprehensive testing that would document her spine's current condition and its capacity for handling flight stress. And she'd remember that second chances were rare gifts that could be revoked instantly if circumstances suggested they'd been mistakes. Vera acknowledged each instruction with single-word confirmations, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that was starting to overwhelm adrenaline's temporary support. The room emptied gradually, Morrison wheeled away by medical personnel who'd been waiting outside, Park departing with folders full of documentation that would protect or condemn depending on how evaluation results manifested. Webb lingered, standing by the window, and Vera understood she was meant to linger as well. When they were alone, he spoke more quietly, setting aside command voice for something closer to human conversation. He told her that he'd reviewed the original incident report, the one from 3 years ago, and found it uncomfortably similar to today's rescue. Same willingness to violate protocol, same impossible aerobatics, same successful outcome that technically shouldn't have occurred. The pattern suggested either that Vera had learned nothing from being grounded, or that the grounding itself had been based on misunderstanding what her capabilities represented. He'd spent 3 years assuming the medical board and psychological evaluation had been correct, that Vera's heroics had been reckless rather than calculated, that her injuries had been warning that her approach to flying was unsustainable. But today's footage had forced reconsideration, because nothing about her performance had seemed reckless. Every maneuver had been precisely calibrated, every risk had been calculated against potential benefit, and the outcome had validated her mathematics despite how improbable success had appeared. Webb admitted he didn't know what that meant, whether it indicated the original evaluation had been flawed or whether 3 years of desk assignments had somehow transformed Vera's judgment. But he was willing to find out, willing to let evaluation data answer questions that his instincts couldn't resolve. He dismissed her then, and Vera left the debriefing room on legs that barely supported her weight, spine screaming with pain that she'd successfully ignored for 6 hours but could no longer suppress. She made it to the women's locker room before her knees gave out, sinking onto the bench between rows of lockers with her flight suit still reeking of sweat and hydraulic fluid and smoke. Her hands shook now that no one was watching, tremors that started in her fingers and spread up through her arms until her whole body participated in the delayed stress response. She'd saved Morrison, destroyed an aircraft, probably ruined her spine's careful healing, and somehow earned a chance to prove that she deserved to fly again. The mathematics of that exchange still seemed favorable, but the cost was becoming clearer with each passing minute. The shower's hot water turned pink as it washed away the day's accumulated grime and blood. Vera hadn't noticed the lacerations on her arms and neck, small cuts from canopy seal failure that had let pressurized air and debris into the cockpit during the worst of the damage. They stung now, sharp little reminders that aircraft accidents killed through accumulation of small failures rather than single catastrophic events. She scrubbed methodically, watching diluted blood spiral down the drain, and tried not to think about tomorrow's medical evaluation. The doctors would find the damage, would document compression fractures and nerve inflammation, and all the evidence that her spine couldn't handle what she'd subjected it to today. They'd recommend continued grounding, and this time there wouldn't be bureaucratic gaps to exploit or technicalities to hide behind. The medical board would have clear documentation that Vera Dalka's body couldn't sustain high-performance flight regardless of what her skills suggested. She dried off and dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a t-shirt that felt foreign after hours in a flight suit, and walked out to the parking lot where her motorcycle waited like a faithful dog. The sun was setting over Nevada mountains, painting the sky in colors that reminded her why she'd wanted to fly in the first place. Not for the adrenaline or the heroics or the call signs, but for the simple transcendent joy of moving through three-dimensional space with nothing between her and horizon except skill and machinery and air. She'd given that up once, accepted grounding as inevitable consequence of pushing too hard, and the loss had been worse than the physical pain. She'd spent 3 years watching other pilots fly missions she'd once led, filing reports about sorties she'd once flown, and feeling herself slowly transforming from ghost into ghost, present but insubstantial, remembered but irrelevant. The desk assignments had been professional death by inches, each day eroding a little more of her identity until she'd started forgetting what purpose felt like. Today had reminded her, and the reminder was almost worse than the forgetting had been. Now she knew what she'd be losing if tomorrow's evaluation went badly, knew exactly what would be taken away, and the anticipation of that loss made her chest tight with something that wasn't quite panic, but wasn't quite anything else either. She rode home through desert twilight, wind buffeting her in ways that would have been pleasant before today's flight, but now just aggravated her damaged spine. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning, coffee cup in the sink, bed unmade, everything marking time until she'd returned from what was supposed to be routine administrative flying. She'd been scheduled to observe Lieutenant Chen's qualification flight, staying safely in trail while he demonstrated basic maneuvers for upgrading his mission status. Simple, boring, the kind of flying that required attention without demanding excellence. And then Morrison's emergency had transformed routine into crisis, and someone had made the decision to redirect her, to trust that Ghost still existed somewhere beneath the administrative purgatory and desk assignments. She collapsed onto her couch without bothering to turn on lights, letting darkness accumulate while her spine gradually relaxed from survival tension into merely excruciating pain. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by muscle spasms and nightmares that mixed today's rescue with the original incident from 3 years ago. In the dreams, she was flying both missions simultaneously, trying to save both Morrison and her original wingman while her aircraft disintegrated around her in slow motion. She woke repeatedly, disoriented and gasping, before finally giving up on rest around 0400 and making coffee that tasted like desperation. The medical evaluation was scheduled for 0600, which gave her 2 hours to prepare for systematic documentation of all the ways her body had betrayed her capabilities. She showered again, dressed in duty uniform rather than flight suit, and reported to the medical facility with 15 minutes to spare. The waiting room was empty except for one other person, and Vera's stomach dropped when she recognized Captain David Chen, the flight surgeon who'd written the psychological evaluation that had contributed to her grounding 3 years ago. He looked older than she remembered, gray threading through his hair at the temples, but his expression was the same careful neutrality that physicians cultivated when dealing with pilots who might be fragile. He stood when she entered, and for a moment they simply regarded each other, two people whose professional relationship had been built on opposite conclusions about her fitness for flight. Chen spoke first, his voice carrying none of the clinical detachment from his evaluation report. He told her he'd watched the gun camera footage of Morrison's rescue, had studied it frame by frame, and had spent the past 8 hours reconsidering every conclusion he'd drawn 3 years ago. The original evaluation had been thorough and had followed established protocols for assessing pilot psychology, but watching yesterday's rescue had forced him to confront the possibility that his frameworks had been inadequate for understanding her decision-making. Heroism and recklessness looked similar when reduced to incident reports and interview responses, but actual observation of performance under stress revealed differences that clinical evaluation couldn't capture. He admitted he'd been wrong, not about her willingness to violate protocol, but about what that willingness represented. She didn't have hero complex tendencies. She had something rarer and more valuable, the ability to recognize when protocol would guarantee worse outcomes than protocol violation, and the courage to accept personal consequences for making that choice. Vera didn't know how to respond to apology from someone whose evaluation had helped destroy her career, so she simply nodded and waited for him to explain why he was here at 0430 on a morning, when she was supposed to be evaluated by different physicians. Chen explained that Webb had requested his presence, not to conduct the psychological reevaluation, but to observe the medical assessment and provide context that might prevent history from repeating itself. The new medical team didn't know Vera, didn't understand her history, and without proper context, they might interpret today's findings as confirmation that she'd never been fit for flight. Chen could provide that context, could help distinguish between physical limitations that made flight dangerous and physical damage that was simply consequence of excellence pushed to sustainable extremes. It was inadequate compensation for his original evaluation, but it was what he could offer. The medical evaluation began precisely at 0600 and continued for 4 hours that felt like 4 days. Physicians prodded and scanned, measuring range of motion and nerve conductivity and bone density, with instruments that transformed Vera's spine into data. They documented 3 compression fractures that had occurred during yesterday's flight, vertebrae that had collapsed partially under G-forces that healthy spines could have handled. They found nerve inflammation that explained the muscle spasms and chronic pain, evidence that her body was struggling to maintain functions that flying demanded. And they discovered scar tissue from the original injury, healed imperfectly, creating structural weaknesses that made catastrophic failure increasingly likely with each subsequent stress event. The lead physician, Colonel Sarah Martinez, delivered her preliminary findings with the careful precision of someone who understood she was potentially ending a career. Vera's spine had sustained significant additional damage during Morrison's rescue, damage that would require months of recovery and possibly surgical intervention. The compression fractures were stable but concerning, indicating that her vertebrae were approaching the point where they could no longer reliably withstand flight stress. Continued high-performance flying would likely result in progressive deterioration, potentially leading to permanent paralysis if catastrophic failure occurred during high-G maneuvering. Martinez paused there, letting the implications settle, before continuing with the clinical recommendations. From purely medical perspective, Vera should be permanently grounded, prohibited from any flight duties that involved aerobatic maneuvering or combat stress. Her spine simply couldn't sustain those demands without unacceptable risk of permanent injury. But Martinez had been flying helicopters before transitioning to flight medicine, and she understood that medical recommendations existed in contexts larger than pure physiology. She'd watched the gun camera footage, had seen what Vera had accomplished with a spine that was apparently 3 fractures away from failure, and the performance suggested that capability couldn't be reduced to bone density measurements and nerve conductivity scores. Chen spoke then, providing the context he'd promised, describing how 3 years ago he'd evaluated Vera, and concluded her judgment was compromised without understanding that he'd been measuring against wrong standard. Military psychology tried to identify pilots whose decision-making was distorted by emotional needs or cognitive biases, pilots who would take unnecessary risks because their identity required heroism. But Vera's decisions weren't driven by need for validation or identity construction. She made calculations that factored in variables that standard risk assessment models ignored, like the fact that some outcomes were acceptable only in worlds where she could live with herself afterward. Letting Morrison die while she observed from safe distance would have been the by-the-book choice, but it would have created damage that no medical intervention could repair, psychological injury that would have been more debilitating than any spinal fracture. Martinez listened without interruption, her expression neutral but her fingers tapping against her tablet in patterns that suggested active processing. When Chen finished, she asked Vera a question that wasn't in any medical protocol. Knowing what her spine's condition was now, knowing the risks of progressive deterioration, would she make the same choice again? Vera answered without hesitation, and her certainty surprised even herself. The answer was yes, and it came from place deeper than calculation or pride. Morrison was alive because she'd spent her spine's stability like currency to purchase his survival, and that exchange rate seemed permanently favorable regardless of her own long-term prognosis. Martinez nodded as though the answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. She made notation on her tablet, and Vera imagined the words appearing in her medical record. Patient demonstrates willingness to accept personal harm for mission success, evidence of either courage or pathology depending on interpretive framework. The distinction mattered enormously, because courage was military virtue while pathology was disqualifying condition, and the difference between them was sometimes just question of whose values were defining normalcy. Martinez delivered her formal recommendation with phrasing that had been carefully constructed to permit multiple interpretations. Vera's current spinal condition did not meet standard criteria for unrestricted flight status in high-performance aircraft. However, her demonstrated capability during recent flight operations suggested that standard criteria might be inadequate for capturing the complex relationship between physiological limitation and operational performance. Martinez recommended continued flight status with specific restrictions. Vera would be cleared for operational flying, but prohibited from training sorties or unnecessary aerobatic maneuvering. She'd be limited to missions where her unique skill set was specifically required, situations where her combination of capability and willingness to accept personal risk provided operational advantage that couldn't be achieved through standard pilot assignment. She'd undergo monthly medical monitoring to document her spine's condition and track whether operational flying was causing progressive deterioration. And she'd be required to work with physical therapy team to maintain maximum possible spinal stability within her structural limitations. The restrictions were significant but not career-ending, creating narrow operational window where Vera could fly without being cleared for routine missions. It was compromise that acknowledged both her capability and her physical reality, threading needle between grounding and unrestricted status. Webb would have final authority on whether to accept Martinez's recommendations, but medical findings provided framework that made approval defensible. Chen added his own statement to the official record, noting that he concurred with Martinez's assessment and wished to formally amend his previous psychological evaluation. The original report had been technically accurate but interpretively flawed, measuring Vera's decision-making against standards that didn't account for the category of pilot she represented. She wasn't reckless or compromised by hero complex. She was simply operating from decision framework that prioritized different variables than standard risk assessment models emphasized, and the results validated her mathematics even when the process looked irregular. Vera listened to them construct professional justification for letting her continue flying, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 3 years. She wasn't being cleared because they'd decided the original grounding had been mistake. She was being cleared because they'd recognized that mistake was insisting there was only one valid way to be pilot, one acceptable relationship between risk and responsibility. Her way was different but not wrong, costly but not unsustainable, and the difference mattered more than the cost. The debriefing with Webb occurred that afternoon in his office rather than the conference room, suggesting this was conversation rather than official proceeding. Vera reported with Martinez's medical documentation and Chen's amended psychological evaluation, evidence that could support return to flight status if Webb chose to interpret it favorably. He reviewed the documents without speaking, his expression giving nothing away, while Vera stood at attention and tried not to let exhaustion show. She'd been awake for 36 hours, her spine was screaming, and the muscle relaxants Martinez had prescribed were making the room's edges soft and imprecise. Webb finally set aside the documentation and told her to sit down, which was either good sign or very bad one. She sat carefully, and he watched her move with the attention of someone cataloging limitations. His first question wasn't about the medical findings or psychological reevaluation. He asked about her call sign, about how she'd earned the name Ghost and what it had meant before the grounding transformed its implications. Vera had to think back to remember, to reach past 3 years of administrative purgatory to when she'd been operational pilot rather than bureaucratic liability. The call sign had come during her second deployment, after a mission where she'd infiltrated contested airspace without triggering any defensive systems, struck 3 high-value targets, and exfiltrated before enemy forces understood they were under attack. Her flight lead had called her Ghost on the flight home, and the name had stuck because it captured something essential about her approach to flying. She moved through space like she was made of different substance than other pilots, finding paths that shouldn't exist and exploiting angles that other people didn't see. Webb nodded as though her explanation confirmed something he'd suspected. He told her that call signs were more than nicknames, that they were operational shorthand for what made each pilot uniquely valuable. Ghost meant someone who could accomplish missions that looked impossible in planning stages, someone who found solutions in spaces between standard procedures and improvised chaos. The grounding hadn't changed that, had just removed her access to airspace where those skills could manifest. He'd reviewed her 3 years of desk assignments and found pattern that was either depressing or inspiring depending on interpretation. Vera had identified inefficiencies in mission planning that other administrators had missed, had suggested tactical modifications that had been adopted by 3 different squadrons, and had written training protocols that were now standard across the wing. She'd been Ghost even from behind a desk, finding angles and exploiting spaces that other people didn't recognize as operational terrain. The question now was whether bringing her back to flight status would enhance that effectiveness or compromise it, whether operational flying would let her maximize her unique contributions, or would distract her with managing physical limitations. Vera didn't know how to answer a question that was really about whether she was more valuable as grounded analyst than flying operator, so she told the truth that was maybe undiplomatic but was at least honest. She was better in the air, not because desk work was beneath her, but because her skills only fully manifested when 3-dimensional space and real-time consequences were part of the equation. Webb accepted her answer without comment and moved to what was apparently his real concern. Morrison's rescue had been successful, but success didn't mean the approach had been optimal or repeatable. Vera had violated protocol in ways that other pilots might interpret as permission to freelance during crises, potentially creating a situation where everyone thought they were Ghost and could make calculation-based decisions to override command guidance. He needed to understand whether what she'd done was teachable, whether her decision framework could be codified into doctrine, or whether she was a unique case that couldn't be generalized. The question was harder than it seemed, because Vera had never really analyzed how she made decisions under stress. The process felt intuitive, like her brain simply recognized patterns and calculated probabilities faster than conscious thought could track. Trying to explain it was like trying to explain how she knew where her hands were without looking at them, something that happened below the level of articulation. But Webb was waiting for answer that could be documented and evaluated, so she attempted translation. She told him that standard risk assessment models used binary variables, categorizing choices as either acceptable or unacceptable based on predetermined probability thresholds. But real operational environments produced situations where all available choices exceeded acceptable risk thresholds, where the question wasn't whether to accept risk, but which risks produced least unacceptable outcomes. Morrison's rescue had been that kind of situation. Watching him die was unacceptable in ways that had nothing to do with probability calculations, because that outcome would have damaged something essential about why pilots existed. Attempting rescue was also unacceptable by standard metrics, because the probability of success had been low and the cost of failure had been high. But the mathematics changed when she factored in that some failures were survivable while others weren't, that destroying her aircraft to save Morrison was kind of failure she could live with while watching him die, was the kind that would have destroyed something that aircraft couldn't fix. Webb listened intently, and his expression suggested he was hearing something he'd suspected, but never heard articulated clearly. He told her that what she was describing was combat decision-making at its most fundamental level, stripped of doctrine and protocol, and reduced to basic mathematics of what mattered. Most pilots never accessed that level of analysis because they were trained to trust procedures that kept them safely within acceptable risk parameters. But procedures only worked when situations stayed within parameters that doctrine anticipated, and the interesting missions always violated those boundaries. He'd built his career on recognizing which pilots could operate effectively outside procedural safety rails, and which ones would crash spectacularly when doctrine didn't provide guidance. Vera was clearly in the first category, but that didn't mean she should be flying. Sometimes the most valuable operators were the ones who could teach others how to think outside procedures without actually having to operate there themselves. He paused then, watching her process what was either job offer or career redefinition, and Vera felt her carefully maintained composure starting to fracture. The offer was elegantly constructed and professionally devastating. Webb wanted her to become instructor for advanced tactical development, teaching pilots how to recognize situations where doctrine would guarantee suboptimal outcomes, and training them to perform the kind of real-time calculation she demonstrated during Morrison's rescue. She'd have office, curriculum development responsibilities, and direct access to most talented pilots in the wing. She'd be shaping next generation of tactical thinking, and her influence, wow,